Hi. Well, in this session, I want to talk about science and faith. Many people seem to think that science disproves religion, particularly, of course, we're thinking of the miracles. And they'll say, oh, science disproves all that, so it's all wrong or it's all lies or whatever. Um, well, interestingly, science itself can use the word miracle or miraculous of its own understandings. For instance, I've been watching Brian Cox and his series on the planets. The word miracle or miraculous occurs even from his own lips when he's accounting for the way in which our solar system developed. And then you watch someone like Tim Peake, who's got a series on the development of planet Earth. And again, some of the things that happened almost defy understanding and invite the use of the word miraculous. And then, if you push things even further, you get to a place that science is where it's completely confounded. For instance, the beginning of everything. We now are in a position where science seems to think that there was some kind of, well, what the quantum physicists call a singularity. So there's something happening at the beginning of everything, which we'll call a singularity. It's hardly a big bang. It's an event which holds so much energy that the universe is created. But how you explain how you get from what we call a singularity in space-time to the creation of the almost infinite amount of matter that there is in the universe, science has no answers for that, and science isn't even close to explaining how that could possibly happen. So, big questions around that whole arena. And then, if you look at the question of how life itself got started, again, science doesn't have any ready answers for how you could get from inorganic matter to organic matter, and from organic matter to the possibility of cells which can reproduce themselves, because that's what you need for life, cells reproducing themselves. So there's a step which is pretty close to miraculous in that whole chain of events. So science is not the big, bad ogre with a stake that is somehow chasing religious thought away. Science itself has many questions which are unanswered, and the more you dig into science, the more the astonishing field of events which don't have a ready answer is revealed. So I tend to think that science actually is the friend of religion. Now, when it comes to the events of the New Testament and the miracles of Jesus, I think it's important to consider what are the greatest miracles first, because they're the ones actually that are really hard to explain away. So the greatest miracle is the beginnings of Christianity itself. Christianity had an almost meteoric and explosive beginning. But when you look at the disciples after the resurrection, after the crucifixion, they were demoralized, they were afraid, they were unsure. They were not a group of people who could start an explosive religion. They didn't have the enthusiasm, they didn't have the energy, they didn't have the hope, they didn't have the courage. And all that changed. And the only thing that can really explain that change is the resurrection. Without the resurrection, I don't think there is Christianity. But with the resurrection, we understand how it was that this demoralized, shattered little group could become the group that gave the world the faith we know as Christianity. Then there's another miracle that is very hard to explain away, and that's the miracle of the conversion of Paul. Paul, as he was previously known as Saul, was an out-and-out opponent of this new rising up Christian faith. He hated it, and he hated it, the fact that it was undermining his precious faith, Judaism. And Paul, or as he was known then as Saul, he was a Pharisee. He was incredibly well educated in the ways of his faith and in other things as well. He was a well-educated man and a man of profound faith, Judaistic faith. And he was determined to stamp out Christianity. He'd been causing Christians to be imprisoned and also to be killed. But something changed. He was on his way to Damascus, and he had an encounter with the risen Christ. That's what he himself says. That's how he explains the change in his own being. He had an encounter with the risen Christ, a vision in which he was challenged, and he could never return to his old ways after that. He became known as Paul, and he became a great exponent of the new faith. And the only way to explain this sudden change of heart from a man who was out and out determined to annihilate and stamp out Christianity to a man who was its foremost exponent is to believe what he says about himself, which is that he had an encounter with the risen Christ. Now, if you accept these two miracles, then it becomes much easier to accept the miracles of Jesus. Because if Jesus was who he said he was, the Son of God who rose from the dead, then the other miracles that he did are small beer in comparison. So, to my mind, the big things, which are really difficult for science to go, that never happened. The big things like the resurrection and the conversion of Paul, if these stand, then the rest can stand as well. Now, science itself, we've talked about how it doesn't have all the answers. It has many, many questions. And I like cosmology and I like quantum physics. I'm not a physicist. I'm not that clever as far as science is concerned, but I really love following the developments that are to be found in cosmology and in quantum physics. And one of the things, again, that's very difficult to explain is life itself, how life comes to be. And the scientists are not near explaining that at all, or how the elements which make up the universe are explained. So, big questions in the field of science. And also, I want to say that science, I don't think, is opposed to religion anyway. I don't think there is some kind of way in which you can say, yes, science disproves religion, and I believe in science. Because actually, if you look at the Bible closely, a lot of what seems to be in opposition to science, like, for instance, the story of creation in Genesis, you could say, oh, well, the beginning of the world never happened like that, so how can you believe anything in the Bible? But to say that is to show a misunderstanding of how the Bible was written and what kind of writing is in it. It's not all trying to prove this or that. It's not all scientific literature. It's history, and it's metaphor, and it's story, and theology. And if you read the beginning, like Genesis, as theology, and the very first chapters are, I believe, to be understood as theology and not history. Yeah, it does morph into history later on, but right at the beginning, it's not some kind of literal history of how the world got started. If you look at it carefully, It's a theology, and it's a theology about the nature of God. And I'd really like to talk a bit more about that in my next session to enable us to have a clearer understanding of what Genesis is actually saying in these first chapters, which are often disputed and held up as an example of how wrong or how mistaken the Bible and Christianity are. So next time we'll have a wee look at the first few chapters of Genesis. See you later.